Welcome to the Change Loves Company podcast,
where I sit down with the creatives, fundraisers, social entrepreneurs, artists and activists, all with one thing in common. They're changing the world for the better through their work. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm recording on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. Always was, always will be.
Justin Medcalf is a proud dad of two and co-founder of Unless Financial, where he helps people use their money to create a fairer, cleaner future. He's been shaped by his parents' humble beginnings and believes finance should be about more than returns. It should be, in fact, about values, relationships, and leaving things better than we found them. Justin has nearly 20 years' experience in responsible investment, ethical finance and innovation, and has worked at Ethinvest, co-founded the Ethical Advisors Co-op, led the Emerald Club, and served on the board of the Responsible Investment Association Australasia. His insights on finance have appeared in The Guardian and the Australian Financial Review, and he's often invited to speak on finance's role in driving positive change. Outside of work, Justin is a non-executive director at Parents for Climate, a community fire unit member, and an enthusiastic soccer coach. We talked about what your money is really doing while you're asleep and why Dr. Seuss provided the inspiration for naming his latest venture. Justin Medcalf, it is an absolute delight to have you in the studio for Change Loves Company. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Dominique.
So you've been working in the financial industry now for quite a while, but you've started your own business called Unless Financial. I love the fact that apparently this is a reference to Dr. Seuss. Can you tell me a little bit about how that name came about?
You're right, Dominique. The name came from the famous book by Dr. Seuss or Theodore Seuss called The Lorax. So there's a famous quote at the end of the children's book, which is, unless you care a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. And so myself and the other two founders, that book resonated to the three of us. But the key thing that resonated to us was not only the book, but the actual meaning of the story and the fact that so much of what we're looking to encourage in our clients and the work that we do is the sense of agency. And in the book itself, one of the characters goes about life thinking about short-term profit and how they can take the most out of nature. And so for those who know the story, that character is the Onceler. And so for us, the interesting thing around that story and how it resonates with our business as well is the journey that many of us go through of being somewhat complicit to the impact they're having to actually moving towards a position of care. And so that's really why Unless to us works well.
Yeah, fantastic. And you talk a lot about what our money is doing while we sleep. And I guess that's a metaphorical asleep as well as overnight, because the money markets don't really sleep, do they? Tell me a bit about that. What do you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, so it's really around the idea that money is never neutral. So if you're someone who has superannuation in Australia, your money is technically not sleeping. It's working for you all the time because a large portion of your super is actually invested offshore. So whether that's in sort of European or American markets, but also a lot more exposure throughout Asia as well. And the idea there is that being passive or being somewhat disconnected to what your money's doing is in many ways contributing to part of the challenge that we have as well by being inactive or being passive with your money. You're allowing the status quo to continue. So if you've got your own personal interests or values that point to having a safer future, climate change is a big concern for a lot of the clients we work with. And so, actually being active with your money and not thinking about, I guess really realizing that it's working for you in both a positive and a negative direction 24/7.
Have things changed? Because I remember back in the day, you didn't really have much choice over your super. You started with a new job. Your employer had chosen a super fund, and your money just went in there. And then if you change jobs, it might change, and a lot of lost super out there. It sounds like people have a lot more choice and agency these days with where they can go, and put their super. Not even to the extent of having, say, a self-managed super fund, but actually just choosing a more ethical option. I've got two questions around that. One is the fact that I attended your great webinar the other day, and you were mentioning about even funds which are called the ethical X fund or whatever, or the sustainable fund, when you actually drill down into the details, and not necessarily that ethical or sustainable. There's a bit of greenwashing going on in the sector, by the sounds of it. And the other thing is, you talked about 3 things that people can do about that. If you're not sure where your money is, or you're not sure what your super fund is actually doing with your money, there are steps you can take. It takes a bit of effort on your part, but there are things you can do pretty much immediately. Can you talk to me first about what's actually out there in terms of choice and finding out, and then what can you do as a consumer, as a super fund user?
For sure. So super choice, so you're right that once upon a time super was far less flexible in the sense of your choice. Super choice came in about 10, 15 years ago. Even those under sort of state or federal awards were sort of limited in choice in the past. Now, having said that, a lot of industry-aligned superannuation funds will provide additional benefits if you're contributing in above the 12% super guarantee that your employer pays. So UniSuper is an example of that, where if you're working for a uni and you contribute a bit extra, usually your employer will contribute, the university in that case, would contribute more as well. So there are some incentives in staying where you are, but as far as choice, all Australians have choice as to where their super is invested. Self-managed super funds definitely one option for those wanting to be more active and play a bigger role in the choice of the underlying investments. But for most Australians who are invested either in industry super fund or retail super fund, so many will call that a public offer super fund, there's a considerable amount of choice available. So your second question, Dominique, there are some challenges when it comes to labelling. Now, the regulator, Australian Securities Investment Commission, also known as ASIC, came down fairly hard in the last two years around some of the larger super funds. There was some real considerable issues around being labelled sustainable or ethical, and also claiming that they weren't exposed to certain industries, but in essence they were. And the reason for that is they had what's called a threshold, so a materiality threshold. And so if a company had less than 10% or 20% of its activity exposed to a particular industry, like say thermal coal or uranium mining, or even tobacco or gambling, they were still held within the portfolio. And so for a lot of superannuation fund members, when they saw that their fund wasn't invested in fossil fuels or excluded, or that particular option excluded gambling as an example, and then it was uncovered that there was still exposure to those industries, the regulator saw that as being somewhat deceitful. So now things have shifted as far as, since the beginning of 2022, 1st of January 2022, superannuation funds had to disclose their holdings. And so that really opened things up quite a lot. There are some loopholes there where I won't get into the technicalities right now. So an individual does have the ability to look into their super fund. It is a bit of work, and there's some tools available, but I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit later.
Fantastic. How much incentive is there from the perspective of the financial institutions to sort of get this right? Are we at a tipping point yet where there's financial benefit for them to
invest in the right place, or are we not quite there yet?
The incentives don't often align with the goals of the super. So if we purely talk about super, given that's a fairly significant pool of capital in Australia, and most Australians would have some amount of super. Just to put a number to it, there's over $4.3 trillion in the Australian superannuation system, which is within the top 5 pools of capital in the globe, across the globe. So there's a significant amount of capital there. One of the challenges for super funds in particular is a performance test. So on an annual basis, they are assessed against their peers, and that performance test is published. And those who score low in the performance test are required to basically improve on that performance. Otherwise, they can be in a position where they have to find an alternative to how they operate, including merging with another super fund. And so the regulator, which is for super funds, APRA, has really wanted to make sure that our retirement savings are doing what they're meant to. But part of the problem is the time frame that these super funds are being assessed is quite short. But for a lot of Australians, their super is, even if you're close to retirement, you're still going to be living off your super potentially for 20, 30 years. Yet the decisions that are being made and how the super funds are often being rewarded is based on 12 months. So to your question around financial incentives, I think unless there's some watering down of the performance test or some exclusion around certain assets, especially assets that are more focused around the energy transition, which tend to have don't tend to always have a short-term payoff. So infrastructure, as an example, doesn't provide income until it's already been built. So that development phase, super funds tend to stay away from because it's higher risk. There's no income during those early stages, but that significant pool of capital can play a significant role in the transition.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people working on that at the moment.
Well, that's good to know. The time frame thing is interesting, isn't it? I literally just saw this morning, I think on LinkedIn, someone was saying that the solar energy output took, I don't know, let's say 50 years to get to a certain terabyte or terawatt, and two years to double. Yes. And so, to what extent does investing in that longer term help with the payoff down the track? Because I know there's an organisation out there literally called We Don't Have Time. And there is a kind of an element of that. We're here in Sydney. It's going to be a 40-degree day. It's going to be much hotter in different other parts of the country. It's like, what are we waiting for?
The system is very much, there's a lot of inertia within the system. I think you're right in the sense of what are we waiting for? Today in Sydney alone is going to be about 15 degrees above average, which, is, and I think on the weekend it's going to drop down to 14 degrees again. So we're having these extreme weather events, obviously the algae bloom in South Australia. We are seeing the impacts of climate change already. For those who think that it's going to be something for the next generation or the generation after,
by the end of the
about.
century. When people use phrases like that, it drives me nuts.
Yeah, well, because there's going to be.
I think you mean this weekend.
Well, yeah, look, we are already seeing the impacts. I was just speaking to my dad the other day, who was sort of talking about, look, I'm not too worried about it in my lifetime. He's in his early 70s, and I'm sort of like, well, look, I hate to say it, you're already experiencing it. So, look, I think there's a combination of things that need to happen, Dominique. The first is we need to really talk about it in the sense of stories and normalise the fact that you can still make comparable returns of ethical investing. There's still this myth. Now, that myth quite often stems from the industry I'm involved with. So the financial advisors that work within Australia quite often still held on to this myth that ethical or responsible investing underperforms.
Obviously, as a financial advisor, as someone running a super fund, whatever it might be, you have a responsibility, as you say. Like, you can't just kind of do you can't just follow the vibe, right? It's got to be there's got to be some rigor there. But how do you guys at Unless Financial approach things maybe a bit differently to others, or how do you get around that
necessity to be, to make money for your clients, but also kind of do the right thing?
Well, we actually try not to get around it. We take an approach which is very much, so just to provide a little bit of extra context, financial planning is what Unless Financial does. Sometimes that can get confused with investment advice, pure investment advice. So we still do provide advice on our clients' investments, but what we try to do is look at a more holistic picture for the client. So first starting off with strategy. So what does the client actually want to achieve in their life? Sometimes clients will straight out mention, I want to have the biggest impact. I'm stressed about climate, about social unrest, all these other issues, inequality. And so sometimes that will come out as one of their key priorities. Other times it's far less of a priority because some of their most pressing concerns are, how do I retire with enough money? How do I afford to pay off my mortgage? Those are, for many Australians and many of the people we work with, the key question that they start with. But they also want to make sure that if they are going to do something with their money, that they are doing it in a positive way, in the sense that they can sleep at night. So going back to your question before around, can your money sleep at night? Can you sleep at night knowing that your money's aligned? And so for us, the financial criteria is really important, and understanding what does that mean for a client. Are they looking for like-for-like market-based return? And are they willing to, in some ways, put that as their highest priority? So what we often find is some clients will have a really high impact priority. So they want to have the most amount of impact. And for some, that involves some philanthropy. So, and what we call catalytic impact. So I'm conscious of the amount of terms that can get thrown around, right. But catalytic impact is, or systemic investing is where we see some clients willing to take less of a return to have a greater impact. And so there's still a financial return in place, but it may not be at what they consider to be market level, because they consider part of their return is the impact. And so when we work through that with clients, it's really about understanding what are the key drivers for a client to achieve their goals, and if they're in a position where they can do more with their money, like what I mentioned before, catalytic impact, we'll address that with our clients, and we've got quite a number of clients that are quite active around more of the catalytic work, because they see the next 4 years now, or 4 and a bit years, as being crucial. And so they're willing to take less of a return. But on the whole, ethical investing performs on par to traditional investing, and I think the evidence speaks to that. Responsible Investment Association has done the benchmarking report over the last 20 years, and every year the longer term performance is actually better than the traditional investments.
Yeah, and I think if we reach a tipping point where investing, say, in fossil fuels, or what, it just really does become untenable for all sorts of reasons, markets dry up or whatever it might be, or regulation comes in, that's probably going to accelerate, do you think?
Definitely, yeah. Look, a lot of the subsidies, there's been big push to remove the subsidies to fossil fuel. You often hear about those who are anti-renewables will often talk about renewables only live, or only viable because of the subsidies. Now we know that is no longer the case. Renewables per kilowatt is much cheaper than fossil fuels. And yes, there's a lot will question the reliability and the base load requirements, but now with the combination with solar, in particular with battery, we're able to see significant shift towards renewables. The other thing that I think is really starting to come out as well, with the mandatory climate reporting, and also nature-based reporting as well, that is voluntary at the moment, but starting to be that's sort of the next frontier around nature-based issues and the nature-related risks. And so once we start to see that come into the mix, I think one of the big challenges is going to be for those that are still exposed to fossil fuels is we are going to see at some point the issue around social license to operate. So we're already starting to see that be the case. The financial the financial, the economics around it are already starting to prove that it's unviable. So a lot of the funders are moving out or not looking to fund fossil fuel expansion projects anymore. But then the other thing is stranded assets. So at some point, when and that's not far away, is the impacts on stranded assets, and that's where a business or let's just say a mining company has valued their reserves, and based on what it would be once they dig it out of the ground. And so the stranded assets is when there's no longer a viable reason economically, or whether that's being pushed by regulations, it's going to stay in the ground.
Take it out than
Correct.
They're going to get from it. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, the one caveat to all of that is critical minerals, and this is quite often a challenge for some of the clients that we work with is critical minerals. And you would have seen overnight, our Prime Minister has struck an agreement with the Orange Man, and so the critical minerals do play a significant role. I think that the challenge around critical minerals is just being able to lift the standards around extraction.
Yes, and it's often the kind of the card that the mining industry plays, isn't it? It's like these things, you need these things every day, and we're the ones who are powering the economy, et cetera. And it's not an unviable argument in the sense that it's not untrue, but as you say, it has to be sort of balanced out, I guess, with making sure they're not creating more problems by what they're doing. So talk to me a little bit about shareholder activism. Obviously, it's not something you guys necessarily facilitate, I presume, or maybe you do. There's some kind of cool organizations out there at the moment helping people, I guess, collectively have some power as shareholders, which as an individual, you may not have. What do you think about those sorts of organizations and the power that consumers do in fact have?
Dominique, I've been a long time advocate for shareholder activism or being an active owner, which is how many in the institutional world would prefer to call it, active ownership. And so, in essence, for those who aren't aware of what shareholder activism is really working with other investors or being an investor in your own right with significant influence to be able to, or significant sort of shareholding in a particular company to influence corporate behavior. And some of that influence is done through just a conversation, but quite often it needs to be accompanied with a shareholder resolution or the risk of a shareholder resolution. And so some of the companies that have been formed in the last couple of years, like Sustainable Investment Exchange, acronym SIX, have done amazing work in their time. So we're close allies with the team at SIX, and we also work with our clients to participate in their shareholder resolutions. And they need 100 shareholders to pass a resolution or to put forward a resolution, I should say. A resolution needs to be passed at an AGM or an EGM. And so the act of putting up a resolution provides or highlights a particular issue. So one of the more recent campaigns that SIX have run are against Bega Cheese and CSL around the use of gas in their operations, and even the risk of bringing this resolution to the CSL AGM forced CSL to take a stand and to really look at, okay, well, how do we shift our practices to be aligned with the requests of these 100 shareholders? So fantastic amount of power, $500 per share per investor, and 100 of them can have a significant amount of power. There's been some other organisations over the years, Market Forces, ACCR as well, which have done fantastic work in shaping the role of active ownership or shareholder activism. But SIX have just taken it to that next level.
Yeah. There's also the option of that sort of direct investment, right? So Birchall as a platform allows you to invest. They're not all necessarily, social enterprise or eco or sustainable investment options, but I think it seems to skew that way. But you can actually just put your money where your mouth is quite directly. And again, they're very careful about the return piece, but
as a long-term option to sort of feel like you're controlling a bit where your money is going, it's pretty powerful.
It is, yeah. The crowdsource funding shift in the regulations that came about almost 10 years ago now really allowed retail investors. So the way the Corporations Act works in Australia is that we have both retail and wholesale or sophisticated investors, and there's some rules around what you're able to, how you're able to categorize yourself as a retail or wholesale investor. Basically, in a nutshell, wholesale investors have a lot more capital at their disposal, and so the regulator views them as being able to take on additional risk, where retail investors tend to have less capital to play with. Not to say that they're any less sophisticated. A lot of retail investors know what they're doing. They just have less money to lose, is one way to put it. And so the CSF, or the crowdsource funding shift, allowed for up to $10,000 into an unlisted company via one of these platforms, and Virtual is definitely one of the leading platforms. It's a great way for investors to get to play an active role as being a shareholder and into an unlisted company, especially one that they value, whether they're a customer of them or not. There are a lot of companies that are raising through the CSF provisions, and that allows everyday retail investors or consumers to own a stake in these companies.
Yeah, and you often get direct access. You can ask questions. They run webinars, things like that. Obviously, that they have to assume that there's the transparency there. But rather than investing in some arcane organization that you don't really know who's running it or what their values might be, it's a really interesting way to invest, I find. So you've been in the financial services sector for a fair while now, a couple of decades at least, is that right? What have you seen?
A couple of decades, yeah.
Is it more than that?
Yeah, no. It's been a couple of decades.
Decades, there you go. Any changes that you've seen, good or bad? How much do you think people working in the sector kind of care about this sort of stuff on the whole?
As far as care, I think there's more players within the industry that definitely care. The ecosystem has developed quite substantially over the last 20 years. I think the key thing that I've noticed over the last 2 decades, Dominique, is really the shift from being a niche to mainstream. I don't want to suggest that we're at the mainstream stage yet. One of the big shifts over that time has been the including environmental, social, and governance factors from a purely risk perspective. So thinking about the risks of one of those three. So it used to be purely just commercial analysis. Now the inclusion of environmental, social, and governance into, so when we talk about that, so environmental issues that are foreseen to be facing the company, any social issues within, whether it's diversity within the organisation, how they treat their staff, modern slavery, governance as well, how they operate as a company, their board composition. Those factors have now become mainstream. So quite often the acronym ESG will be used as a reference to a fund or a super fund, including those factors in their decision-making process. It doesn't mean they screen out industries that rate poorly in any of those factors, but they incorporate that in their decision-making. So that's been a massive shift over the last 20 years. That is now considered mainstream. Anyone that's not considering ESG factors is very much behind the curve, and you would consider considerable laggards, and it is having an impact on their performance as well. I know in the US there's been a big shift and concern around the ESG, but over the rest of the part of the world, especially in Europe, there's been only considerable drive towards deepening those considerations and putting financial metrics to them as well, not only just risk metrics. And so I think the institutional end of the market has done a lot. It could do a lot more. And so when I say institutional, that's sort of really large super funds, asset owners, government-backed institutions, etc. The retail end, I think there's been a considerable amount of shift in awareness. So more and more people know that you can actually align your investments or your savings with your values now. Now that awareness shifting to becoming the norm is still on its way. I think within the next 5 years, we're going to see that be the case. And that's a big part of the reason why Unless exists, is that we don't want to see this just at the fringes and to just work with high net worth clients who can actually afford to seek advice. Ideally, we would like to have everyone be able to make a conscious decision in where their money is invested.
So we talked earlier, you mentioned earlier about some tools and some sort of tactics. Can you tell me a little bit about what can people do if they're listening to this and thinking, I actually don't know what my super fund is doing. Where do I start?
So there are some tools available, which is a really important element of where the industry has come over the last 20 years, is providing some of these publicly facing tools. Should help, in most part, investors, superannuation fund members, understand how their money is being invested. First place to start, if you're thinking it from a super fund perspective, is your super fund. As I mentioned earlier, disclosure of their underlying holdings is mandatory. So that's a good place to start. Quite often, even if you look at the holdings, there's a lot of names there that the average punter isn't going to understand who they are, what industries they're exposed in. So there's been some additional tools developed by the peak body, so Responsible Investment Association of Australasia, or RIA, RIAA, have established a tool that anyone can sort of jump on and do a search. Also, the Ethical Advisors Cooperative have established a green leaf rating system, which is also publicly available. So there's those two tools alone are a great way to start for anyone wanting to learn more. But look, if you're struggling at any stage, calling up your super fund, asking them, it's your money, you're a member of that super fund, or if you've got a financial advisor like you did, Dominique, and you ask the question, if they give the answer that you're going to lose money out of ethical investing, if you go to the Responsible Investment Association benchmark report and just pull out the table which shows the past performance figures and share that with them, I think you're doing a great step in actually educating financial advisors. They should be educating you, but it can often go both ways. So those are the key steps, I think. Do a bit of your own research if you can. If that fails, then you've got these two tools, responsible returns on the RIA website or the green leaf rating, and then pick up the phone, send an email, do something that will help you understand where your money is.
Brilliant. So last one from me. You mentioned your father who's in his 70s, and even at that age, he'll be feeling the impacts of what's going on at the moment. Having kids, does that kind of influence what you do in your working life as well? And what sort of future do you, want for them, but also envisage? What do you think is coming?
That's a tough question. Look, I think there's a couple key themes that I'm concerned about. I try to sort of consider myself to be an optimist, a realist optimist. As Jane Goodall mentioned, the late great Jane Goodall mentioned, hope is key. We need to hold on to hope. Otherwise, we fall into apathy. And so I think I have hope that as a society, we will start to see a shift. My concern is that shift will happen too slowly. Artificial intelligence is probably one of the other key concerns that I have. I'm hopeful that we can find a way to use AI in a productive way that doesn't displace us and put the tech bros in control of our future. And so, there are a lot of things to be optimistic about. There's a lot of, I think most of the problems and the challenges that we have, if we purely look at climate, we know enough now. We have the solutions. One key issue that we often hear about is the energy transition, but another issue we often don't hear about is deforestation and the impact of the beef industry. It's almost seen as taboo to say anything negative against the beef industry in Australia, but the beef industry is a key enabler or key driver to the mass deforestation that's happening predominantly in Queensland and other parts of the country. And the fact that we've got positive things happening on the transition, but we're bulldozing football fields worth of native forests every day, to me, it's they're the lungs of the earth. The other key issue around oceans, we're starting to see and learn more about what's happening in the oceans. So to me, it's a challenging world ahead for our kids. Personally, my wife and I, we try to give them as much of a positive upbringing as we can, but it's hard for them not to also notice things. My daughter this morning was like, quite fearful of what summer's going to look like for her, and she's 13. Yeah. And so, kids are talking about this. They're seeing this. One of our colleagues at Unless, she's in her mid-20s, and she talks about a lot of her friends not actually planning much in the future. So they're really starting to live for the shorter term. Yeah. Having great time and fun as a mid-20-year-old is something that I'm sure all of us remember. But the fact that when they look ahead over the next 5-10 years, it's there's a lot more uncertainty, I think, is troubling.
Yeah, I don't know if you're aware of Damon Gamo's most recent initiative, the Future Council, which is a bunch of sort of 11, 12-year-olds buttonholing CEOs all around the globe and basically saying, what are you doing? Absolutely amazing. And I think that's the one thing that does give me some hope is the fact that young people are kind of stepping up. I mean, not all of them, obviously. But I think in many ways they do have the most to lose. Like, we've lived pretty good lives up to this point. If you're in your 50s, 60s, 70s and above, potentially the world we're leaving these kids is going to be a shit show. And I think it's great that they're stepping up, and the Greta Thunbergs of the world are just kind of telling it like it is. And I think hopefully that is the future.
Couldn't agree more. And massive fan of everything that Damon's done over the last 10 years. 2040 is a great clip, a great film to watch as well. Look, and I think just to add, Dominique, I do agree in the sense that the generational shift will happen. And I think, the more that the next gen can be vocal and influence their parents and their grandparents, I think that's a really powerful shift that I think is already happening. The other thing that we notice at Unless is how many more of the older generation actually are quite considerate around the legacy that they're leaving. We often talk about, how do they pass on their own values through to the next generation or to the generation beyond. And so we're often seeing those in their later years wanting to impart their views or their values in their decision making, and legacy is sort of part of that. I think they want to really make sure that their kids remember them for the right reasons.
It's never too late.
That's true.
We'll leave it on that note. Justin, so good to see you after all these years.
Likewise.
And thank you so much for joining us on Change Loves Company.
Thanks for having me.